Good morning. My name is Tara McDuffie, and I'm the Executive Director for the Division of Global Affairs here at Kennesaw State University. I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for today's panel discussion. Through these sessions, our goal is to provide opportunities for you to connect with global ambassadors to the United States and have engaging discussions and topics that are of interest to you. As KSU celebrates the Year of Greece during Greece's bicentennial anniversary, we are extremely pleased to have today's discussion on geopolitics. Today's moderator will be Dr. Joshua Israel, Professor of Journalism and Emerging Media and Director of KSU Graduate Studies Program. Dr. Israel will have the pleasure of introducing our panelists.
Thank you, Tara. It is my privilege to introduce our guest speaker for today's Consular Connections program. Theodoros Dimopoulos is the Greek Consul General here in Metro Atlanta. He has run the Consul General's office for a year, having arrived in November 2020. He earned his bachelor's degree in International and European Studies from the University of Piraeus in Greece. He holds a master's degree in international relations, and he has a leadership degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. In 2015, Mr. Dimopoulos joined the Greek Foreign Service. His first overseas assignment was at the Greek Embassy in Moscow, Russia, serving in a variety of positions from attaché to second secretary. He speaks French, German, Russian, and Turkish. At the Atlantic Consul General's office, Mr. Dimopoulos assists Greek citizens with their renewal of passports, military service matters, and powers of attorney. He also represents Greece in forming potential partnerships with businesses and educational institutions, including Kennesaw State University. Consul General Dimopoulos is speaking with us about the Melian Dialogue from 416 BC, an important military event in Greek history, and how we can apply this to today's global international relations. After his talk, Dr. Stephen Collins, a professor at KSU's School of Government and International Affairs, will be joining our panel discussion. Mr. Dimopoulos, welcome. Please go ahead and start your presentation.
Welcome. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for giving me this chance today. So not to waste our time, I will start with the presentation. So today, as you said, we will be speaking about the Melian Dialogue, which is an event that takes place during the mid-late years of the Peloponnesian War, 431-44 BC. So the two main and rival factions of the Peloponnesian War were the Delian League, led by Athens, and the Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta. The incident takes place during the Peace of Nicaeas, signed 421 BC, which lasted approximately for 6 years, ending the first half of the war. Now, on the next slide, on the synopsis, we will take a brief look on what happened in general in this event of the Peloponnesian War. The dialogue of the Melians with the Athenians is one of the most dramatic episodes of the Peloponnesian War and is narrated in the 5th book of the history of Thucydides. The incident happened in 416 BC. The Athenians attacked Milos, a small Lacedaemonian Spartan colony, in order to force it to join in the Delian League. The Melians demanded that the right to remain neutral in the Athenian conflict with Sparta would be respected and should be respected. Eventually, the Athenians, taking advantage of their enormous military superiority, occupied Milos, executed all the adult men, exterminated the women and children, settling 500 Athenian settlers on the island. The dialogue has been recorded in history as the confrontation between law and power. Most likely, at this point, Thucydides is intended to present his own version of the transformation of the Athenian alliance, the Delian League, into a hegemony and ultimately a tyranny. It strongly resembles the triptychon of the dramatic poetry that we see in ancient Greece, which is Ivris, Thesis, and Nemesis. Nemesis for the Athenians came a little later with their destruction in Sicily during the Sicilian expedition, which would take place the year next, 415 BC, and ultimately by losing the war. This historical event is the starting and reference point of the realistic way of thinking in international relations. From the text itself emerges the ruthlessness, for some perhaps the inhuman and provocative arrogance of power, and the tendency of those who wield it towards injustice and self-destruction. Now, let's take a look at the events on the next slide. The Athenians encamped outside the city walls and sent ambassadors to negotiate in an effort to pacify the island without the use of force. The Melians did not present the Athenian ambassadors before the people, as was done in other cases, but obviously afraid that the people would be distracted by the arguments of the Athenian ambassadors and would not make the right decision, they asked them to report the purpose of their arrival directly to the authorities of the place and the government council of Milos. The Athenians explained to the Melians that they consider those islanders who have not yet submitted or pled allegiance as dangerous to their hegemony. They also pointed out that their discussion cannot be based on the concept of law and what is just is based on the interests of the strongest. That if they want their city to be saved, they must submit to the Athenian hegemony. That they are not interested in their friendship, but instead prefer their hatred, which will be the proof of their power over their allies and subordinates. For the Athenians, those islanders who are required to remain independent were simply reckless, thus they cannot allow this. This is an argument with particularly strong, but also cynical arguments for the Athenians in an attempt to persuade the Melians and turn them towards them. The Melians, on the other hand, are timid and, on their fear, present weak arguments for evasion. They claim that the Spartans, to whom their colony belongs, will not allow any trouble to happen to them, contrary to what the Athenians say. They also claim that the gods are on their side and that the Athenians, no matter how good they are, they will not be able to oppose the Spartans. Now, on the next slide, we see the nativity of national interest, which is a basic assumption of realism. What the Athenians realize is that the Melians, on their despair, in an attempt to remain neutral and not to be in danger, fail to understand that the Spartans are capable, which means that they can afford, to sacrifice the good of some of their colonies in order to achieve a superior national interest of their own. The Athenians, experienced connoisseurs of international politics of their time, know that such a thing will happen, which means that Sparta will not assist Milos. Was Milos as valuable to the Spartans as the Melians believe? History proves otherwise. In this chapter, Thucydides elaborates on the issue of national interests, which has played a particularly important role in the development of international relations, and it is one of the cornerstones of realism as a theory of international relations. According to realism, the state is the guarantor of territorial integrity and the security of the population, its morals, and its distinct way of life. The national interest is always the highest regulatory factor in foreign policy issues and choices. Human society and morality are confined within national borders and do not extend to international relations, which is a political arena of great unrest, tension, disagreement, and conflict between states, where the great powers will always have the first say as they have the lion's share. Now, on our next slide, we will see what the Athenians said that the strong, and what the Melian dialogue incident demonstrated is that the strong is imposed to the extent of his power, and the weak caves in to the extent of his weakness. The Athenians demonstrate the superiority of the strong over the weak, both with their words and with the punishment that they inflict upon the Melians. According to the Athenians, the strong is imposed as much as his strength allows him, and the weak, the Melians in this case, must retreat as much as his weakness imposes. One must take into account what happened in Athens during the period of prosperity of those golden 50 years which begin in 478 BC. It is shortly after the end of the Persian Wars where the Greeks win over the Persians. And we have also the founding of the Delian League, the Athenian alliance, and ends in 431 with the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. During this period, the habits and ethics of people had changed greatly due to economic and political fermentations that occurred, which had direct and indirect side effects. It is not surprising thus that for the Athenians, maintaining of their hegemony had become a sacred affair, for which they had to use every means, without moral barriers, with overt violence if need be. It would sound peculiar if they cultivated the idea that they're saving Greece and benefiting their allies by exploiting them, which was the case for the Delian League. The expansion of Athens and its political attitude towards enemies, neutrals, and even allies was a normal consequence, an aftermath of institutions that circulated legally in the 50-60 year period that elapsed from 478 to 416 BC. The fruit of that fermentation and evolution was Athenian imperialism. Now, on the next slide, we pass on to the destruction of Milos, which demonstrates the prevalence of power. However, the Melians' maneuver to work close to what is just and counting on Spartan intervention was not able to protect them. The siege of the city of Milos began, and during the winter of the following year, the Melians, exhausted by hunger, were forced to surrender unconditionally. The Athenians, as we said before, killed the entire male population of the island, sold their wives and children as slaves. After the massacre, 500 Athenian settlers were sent to live on the island. The Athenians did not feel that they were violating any divine law. They talk about the natural law of the strong that is always imposed on the weak. They say, we follow this natural law. We have not said it, nor are we the first ones to use it. It existed, and after us it will exist forever. You would do the same in our position. All those who reach the point of our power will do the same. The importance of power to the theory of realism here seems to be and is the core of the Athenian thought. It is no coincidence that Thucydides, who recorded this dialogue, is considered as one of the fathers of classical realism. Now, on the next slide, we will delve into international relations, a little bit theories, and we will pass from realism to political cynicism and tragedy. For the Athenian, realism lays at the core of their approach. Thus, individual interest is of no importance in the face of the national interest, for which they can literally sacrifice everything to secure it. If we summarize the developments which have occurred from the formation, as we said, of the Delian League 478 BC until 416 BC, in the domestic and foreign policy of Athens, and add to this the suspicion, cruelty, and overt unwilling of violence, which brings, or rather justifies war, then it will not be difficult to understand and integrate in the historical developments of the time the culmination of political cynicism and tragedy that occurred in Milos in the spring of 416 BC. Of course, we attribute the expression of political cynicism to the Athenians for the arrogant way in which they exploit their power and despise every notion of law. The tragedy refers to the Melians, who live peacefully and undisturbed, and being weak in front of the strong, invoke justice and painfully realize how right the strong is, and that what is lawful is not always right when power dictates the righteousness of things. Now, on the next slide, we will see, which is the reason why we will be discussing on this event of the Peloponnesian War. It's the impact of the Melian dialogue and of Thucydides on the fathers of realism. So we have Thomas Hobbes, Thomas Schelling, Hans Morgenthau, and Niccolò Machiavelli. It's just I picked some, and I would like to elaborate on this a little bit more on the next slide. Hobbes. It is noteworthy that the theory of realism was based on the way the Athenians behaved in their international relations realm, which, according to modern statutes, it's called statehood. For the realists, the state is the main actor, as sovereignty is its hallmark. The notion of a sovereign state is inextricably linked to the use of force. Within a specific territorial area, sovereignty means that the state has the supreme power to enact and enforce laws. This is the basis of the unwritten agreement between individuals and the state. According to Hobbes, we give our freedom in exchange for the guarantee of security. However, in the absence of security, there can be no statehood. Therefore, the first move of realism is to organize power within it. In this sense, each state is a state of power. For the Athenians, power has started from within so that it can be maintained abroad. only after the power is organized can the community start existing. On the next slide, we have Schilling speaking about strategic realism. Athens of that time is the embodiment of strategic realism, a theory best represented by Thomas Schilling and others. For Schilling, foreign policy is a technical matter, and therefore there is no question of a moral dilemma. In foreign affairs, one does not care much of what is good or what is right. The primary concern, as mentioned above, is to seek the ingredients of a successful policy. The use of military force is of particular concern to military realism. In addition, according to Schilling, brutal violence is effective when exercised, while the possibility of possible blows is more effective as a backup. It's the threat of violence that can make someone succumb or consent. For this reason, we need to know what is valuable to the opponent and what scares him the most. Coercion is a way to find the opponent at the negotiating table and ultimately do what we want without having to force him to do so. The next slide we see on Hans Morgenthau about the primacy of national interest that we discussed before during this presentation. Responsible politicians, says Morgenthau, are not free as sovereign leaders to act in the most beneficial way, but they must act with full awareness that mobilizing and exercising political power in international affairs inevitably means moral dilemmas, morally reprehensible and sometimes legal actions, choices. As in this case of the Athenians, who threatened to commit and finally do commit immoral acts, they exterminate the whole male population of Milos. However, this was necessary for them to promote and protect what they considered, that is, their national interest. On the next, one of my favorites of Niccolò Machiavelli, in his script, Il Principe, he says, finally, according to Machiavelli, who is also deeply inspired by Thucydides and the pioneers of realism, his attitude also seems to justify practices similar to those of the ancient Athenians. His cruel treatment of humanity is also evidenced in his famous work, The Ruler, Il Principe, it's the translation from Italian. The exercise of foreign policy itself is a Machiavellian activity based on sound assessments of personal power and interests in relation to those of adversaries. Above all, according to Machiavelli, a responsible leader cannot function effectively if he tries at the same time to abide by the rules of Christian ethics. Finally, in our epilogue, the Melian dialogue, as preserved and presented by Thucydides, has a dramatic relevance, not only for us, but for humanity in general, which witnesses many such dialogues in many variations between the all-out arrogance of the powerful and the strong confrontation of small peoples. From the text itself emerges ruthless, inhuman, and provocative the arrogance of power and the tendency of power towards injustice and self-destruction. This is perhaps the most famous example of the way in which classical realism perceives international relations. That is, as an anarchy of different states that have virtually no choice unless they operate in accordance with the principles and practices of power policies, and war is the supreme regulator. But this is the necessity of power. It leads to arrogance, injustice, destruction. It's what the ancient Greeks and ancient Greek tragedy described as ivris, thesis, nemesis. This is the necessity of things: unstoppable expansion, greed without moral barriers, apotheosis of cynicism until it reaches a dead end. That this is the destruction. That would be it. Thank you.
Mr. Dimopoulos, thank you so much for that interesting presentation. Joining us now is Dr. Stephen Collins, an international relations professor in the School of Government and International Affairs here at Kennesaw State. He has published articles about foreign policy and international relations in several journals, including Place Branding and Public Diplomacy and Global Change, Peace and Security. He has also presented conference papers focusing on the denuclearization of weapons. Dr. Collins, welcome, And let's begin our panel discussion. Mr. Dimopoulos, I guess my first question that I would like to start with to get this conversation going is you did a wonderful job showing us how Athens used outright military might and arrogance in invading Melos. Athens, as we know, is a regional power, but it still suffered from its military aggression when it lost the Peloponnesian War to Sparta. What are the lessons that we can take from this incident as we apply it to today's global powers?
Yes, thank you, Joshua. This is a wonderful question. And why do we study extensively the Peloponnesian War? Because we have a paradox. Athens was the naval power of the time, and Sparta was the continental power of the time. By tradition, naval powers, when they collide with continental powers, almost always prevail. This does not happen in the case of Athens. So Athens's policy during the Peloponnesian War, apart from moving within the triptychon of Ivris and Thesis and Nemesis, is a little bit suicidal. So let me just present to you some arguments on this. First of all, during the first year of the war, Pericles, I think everybody knows who Pericles is, will die in the plague which will ravage the city during 430 BC. Pericles said that as long as the Athenians did not face the Spartans decisively at land and use their naval supremacy and did not engage in expeditions far away from its base, Athens, it can withstand and ultimately win the war. As we see the year after the Melian destruction, the Athenians embark on the Sicilian expedition on 415 and they get annihilated. Oppressing their allies is another issue. The Athenians were oppressing their allies in the Delian League regarding their contributions, financial contributions. Another thing that will lead to Athens' demise. In the later years of the war, it was Alcibiades's treason, who during the Sicilian expedition was informed that he's been accused of sacrilegiousness back in Athens, accusation probably staged from his political opponents who fled and seek refuge in Sparta. Alcibiades is a key figure after Cleon and Pericles in the Peloponnesian War. Alcibiades, despite being eccentric as a character, he was one of the most, if not the most charismatic leaders of Athens, and he fled to Sparta. A while later, in the naval battle of Arginuses, 406 BC, a little while before the end of the war, the Athenian fleet decimates the Peloponnesian one. The Athenian admirals who won the battle are being led to a trial and executed for not saving Athenian castaways after the battle due to extremely harsh weather conditions. So what I would like to say with all that is that the main lesson is that the power and demise engages, as it is in our case, Athens, engages in a self-fulfilling prophecy, a vicious downward spiral, a vicious circle where it cannot interpret and read events as it should. I think that the events that I described a little while ago prove this, and it seems as unavoidable as every empire, no matter how powerful it seemed. If we search across the root of history, every empire, no matter how powerful it seemed, eventually was led to its demise and fall for not reading the signs.
Dr. Collins, do you agree with the Consul General's perspective?
Well, yes, and first, thank you, Consul, for such a fantastic discussion of the Melian dialogue and how it applies to what we see as a realist position in a growing realist position in international relations today. And this is such a wonderful discussion because the classic Hellenistic period of ancient Greece is just a wonderful factory, if you will, for so many examples and lessons that we can apply to today's international relations beyond. And many of these observations and lessons are made by the Athenian scholar general Thucydides. So it really is a classic tome in international relations. And this argument of, or this position by realism, and in many ways there's sort of two branches of realism, at least two branches, but the two dominant variants are offensive and defensive realism. And the Athenians opted for the sort of offensive realism that says, look, we have an opportunity and to grow, we have an opportunity to expand, and we are going to take this opportunity in order to reach at power at all costs. And as opposed to operating defensively by building up their arsenals, acting in the terms of Teddy Roosevelt, who didn't always live up to his adage, but to walk softly but carry a big stick. And so we see that this adoption of the Athenian posture often leads to the demise of regimes. We've seen it throughout history, in a very famous book by Kennedy about the demise, the rise and fall of great empires. And we saw it very classically in World War II, where you had regimes within Germany and in Japan who adopted that very realist realpolitik strategy of advancing, using military might, trying to grasp at more power, at more glory. And in the end, it was self-destructive. It was counterproductive. Both of these regimes catalyzed a counterbalancing response by the international community that led to their own demise. And so this is a lesson that states should embrace today, that although a powerful state may be able to go on the march, may be able to go on the offensive, just because you can do that doesn't mean you should, doesn't mean that it is ultimately fruitful, ultimately productive.
Very interesting, Dr. Collins. I want to ask you a follow-up question to what you just said. Oh, go ahead, Consul.
Yes, just one remark from what Dr. Collins has said. Yes, another element which is crucial for powers and for empires, which is a hint that I made in the beginning also, and I absolutely agree with you about offensive realism, is that of strategic overreach. This is why in the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, Pericles says, do not make expeditions far away. That's strategic overreach, and Athenians pay for that. We will see that, and we saw that during the Cold War with strategic overreach of the Soviet Union. It wanted to bring revolution, let's say, or the communist regime in various areas of the world, and it reached a point where it could not sustain those regimes there. That's strategic overreach. So it is another element that is being depicted painfully for the Athenians with their destruction in their Sicilian expedition. Sorry.
No, that's fine. Dr. Collins, I had a follow-up. You mentioned offensive realism. What is an example of defensive realism?
Well, defensive realism would be a situation where a regime does not eschew, does not reject the use of military force, does not pursue pacifism, but builds up its arsenal so that it can deter attacks on it, so that it becomes so powerful that it can mete out devastating retaliatory response against any states that will threaten its security. There's a sort of a spectrum in which that can apply. One element of the spectrum that is the most cautious would be to wait for an attack to come, and then to respond to that attack with a withering response. The other end of the spectrum would be a little bit more forward-leaning in that if there is evidence that a patent, a true manifest threat emerges in the world, then to use military force preemptively against that true threat, as opposed to simply going on the offensive in order to build one's military might, in order to become a global hegemon that could, conquer and monopolize power.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that our viewers understood the difference between offensive realism and defensive realism.
Okay,
So
thank you.
we have our first two questions that have come in from one of our viewers today. This is from, give me a moment here. This is from Jinyi Gu, and she is asking two questions. I think, Consul General, you'd be the perfect person to answer the first one. How do supranational/international institutions, such as the European Union or the United Nations, affect this tragic cycle of hubris nemesis, or perhaps pose an alternative to the realist perspective? Can you take that on?
Yes, that is a nice question. I think that what comes after strong realist actors in the international scene is collective security formations. So even from ancient Greek history, we will see that after the Peloponnesian War and after the war between Thebes and Sparta, we have collective formations from various parts of Greece that gather and make a coalition. Let's say we witness more or less the same in Europe. We have the First World War and the second one, where we have strong powers in Europe monopolizing and having a system of power with 5 approximately main poles at that time, okay, of the First World War and then on the second. So on the formation of coalitions, what I would say is that in the vacuum of power, in the absence of a strong player in the international scene, we have the formation of coalition. So if we see that, and we start from low politics, moving on to the higher politics of security and political integration, the European Union was as such. It first started from coal and steel, right? So it was first an economic venture, which started earlier on, which from 1832, 1834, from before Germany was unified, we had in 1834 a customs union between the different duchies of Germany, which was called the Zollverein. So then we move on from that, and we have the formation of the European Community of Coal and Steel, and we march on to this day. So, but as Thucydides says, the international scene is of the nature of anarchy. So even within unions, there will be, let me put it like this, states or parts or members which will be more equal than others. This is power related. And it is a period of circles. This is my perception on this in history. There were periods that coalitions and supranational entities seemed the norm. I think that nowadays, as we march in the 21st century, we have a turn again to traditional realpolitik, as the Germans would say, to a power struggle between the international actors and the federalist venture experiment, if you want, or the federalist story has demonstrated in many cases that it does not work as it should have been, because mainly the actors that form the coalitions, they are not willing to give away much of their sovereignty.
Mhm.
They want, it is another issue of sovereignty. This is why most of these coalitions, like our friend that says here about the European Union, the UN, okay, the European Union has moved on to becoming also monetary. We have our common currency, which is a step which also refers though to low politics, soft politics. So we're moving on, of course, to force a political union as well. But the issue of sovereignty and the issue of history of each of the nations of each part makes it more difficult. If you ask me, I think that history proves that power regulates things. It should not be as such. International law should, but we have many cases that we have seen that the United Nations, we have resolutions from the UN and decisions from the UN Security Council, which had not been implemented. International law is there to put an order to the international stage of relations, which is anarchic by nature. But I don't think that this is very realistic, that this will regulate things, and we'll witness it nowadays in many cases.
Right. Right. Dr. Collins, I want to bring you back in for this conversation here, because the next question is from Shanaz Siler-Bokus, and she wants to know how realism fits into our global quest for sustainability. And I think that's a very important question, considering that we have world leaders gathered in Scotland over the last 2 weeks, trying to figure out if global climate change can be brought under control in some way. How do you talk about sustainability goals, climate goals, vis-a-vis realism?
Yeah, realism in many ways presents a challenge to this. And so the other prominent theory of realism, worldview, is liberalism, which is the theory that emerged in the era of Enlightenment that informed the establishment of the United States and other democracies, and which was the impetus for what was known as the liberal internationalist era after World War II, in which the idea was that the realist politics that were evident in the 1930s were disastrous for the world. Okay, and many of this again was the offensive realist measures. In that, an element of realism that Consul Dimopoulos captured very well is self-interest, and what liberal and that countries. And Thucydides spoke about this as well, Machiavelli spoke about this as well, is that leaders do not have a responsibility to the world, they have a responsibility to their own countries, right? However, the theory of liberalism said, look, that our own interests will not be served if we're only going to pursue our narrow, myopic interests, that there are collective problems that we have to grapple with in the world, and we can only do that through cooperation. And so therefore, through cooperation, through buying into international law, international agreements, and complying by international cooperation, we will promote our own self-interest. So it's enlightened. It's an enlightened self-interest. And so when we're dealing with, and this is especially important for the environment, in that this view of classical realists that we must only focus on the issues of our own state is going to be disastrous for humanity. because of climate change, because of global warming. And for the interests of each country, one must adopt more of a liberal internationalist perspective in that supranational organizations, global organizations such as the Conference of the Parties that is meeting right now in Scotland are important, and countries have to cooperate, have to be able to sign on to agreements that give up a little bit of their sovereignty, give up a little bit of their ability to regulate their own policy, because through that cooperation will lead to a sustainable future that will ultimately be in those countries' self-interest. And I think the way that you're going to have to sell this is through the lens of realism, because we live in a world that we have evolved over the 20th century, away from pure realism to what I'll call a hybrid of realism and liberal internationalism, or realism and liberalism in the world, in which liberalism will say, we should work together, we should work cooperatively. It was the force behind the UN, it was the force behind the World Trade Organization, and it's led to a lot of progress in the world, significant amount of increase in peace. By empirical standards will show that, a regulation of international trade and so on. But realism, this idea that people are unwilling, and state leaders are unwilling to yield their sovereignty, unwilling to make sacrifices, that sort of self-interest perspective will probably always be there. So what you have to do is to appeal to that self-interest and say, look, it is in your self-interest, China. It is in your self-interest, the United States. It is in your self-interest, Europe and other large countries, to cooperate, sign on to international agreements on the environment, on climate change, because without that level of cooperation, then we will never be able to avoid the climate disaster that is coming, that will affect all of us, right? And cooperation through international organizations overcomes this collective action problem, whereas I might want to cooperate, I might want to do my due diligence and responsible thing on the environment, but if I know other countries aren't doing the same, then I won't be a fool and cut my emissions down to zero while everyone else is, burning, dirty coal and so on. So only by signing on to those agreements in which everyone signs on to a particular accord, and there's a monitoring of the compliance with that accord, are you going to be able to reach actual global action that prevents the climate disaster?
Okay. Consul General Dimopoulos, I want to ask you a question, because since you work for the Greek Foreign Ministry and represent your country here in the Southeast, you live this. You live this balance of sovereignty, but also cooperation with the European Union. We know that in the last year, Greece, like a lot of countries, have had these tragic forest fires. When you sit in on meetings with your foreign ministry colleagues, what are you all talking about with this international cooperation for the environment versus protecting Greece's sovereignty?
Yes, that is a good question. I pretty much agree with Dr. Collins that it is an issue of, first of all, that we should cooperate. That first, within the European Union, we have some elements which are some principles. For example, I will explain it briefly so that everybody can understand. If there is an issue that we can solve at a local level, for example, if we have an issue with forest fires or floods, anything that we can solve at our level as Greece, we will solve it. If we see that it is becoming a real threat yes, we will yield a little bit of our sovereignty, if you put it like this, and we will give permissions for, let's say, EU aircrafts, let's say specifically for forest fires, uh, to fly into our airspace and operate land in our air bases and all the stuff. It is an equilibrium that you should balance how you exercise it without yielding too much of sovereignty. This is why we see so far, as I spoke before, that at least within the European Union, we have not yet uh, moved on to the formation of a political union, because everybody is discussing about, if we move on to a political union, how much sovereignty, how much of my sovereignty should I yield? And and especially another period that I can refer to, and we have seen it a little bit in other countries as well, during the economic crisis with austerity measures and all the stuff. We had many increase as well, and in other EU countries that faced with deficit issues like Italy, for example, we saw that there was a movement in Europe and a discontent that, why should I implement decisions that Brussels are imposing on me? Why should I implement decisions that are being decided in someplace else? So these are the contradictory facts that one should learn, should manipulate, and should use to achieve, again, though, national interest.
Dr. Collins, Chuchu Obiekwe is asking a question that I think you might be interested in answering. Chuchu wants to know, how should a state protect its national interest? For example, the need for resources, security, and trade, and not do it in a defensive, realistic way, because it boils down to an issue of winners and losers. So how do you go about getting what you need for your state if you're not being offensive in some way? And I don't mean offensive as in insulting, but offensive realism.
Right. Well, and this is a dilemma that is faced by many small states in the world. I mean, United States and countries such as Russia and China and, European Union, they have the, if you will, luxury of making this decision, of making a choice between acting defensively, offensively, asserting military force, not asserting military force. But most of the countries of the world are not in a power position to do this. And they have to then wisely rely upon skilled diplomacy in order to pursue their interests. And much of this is going to come down to making the argument that we presented before, that it is in the rational interest of the great power states, of all states, to cooperate on issues that affect the entire global community, because we've realized today, certainly the United States has realized this today, and certainly this seems to be where American public opinion is, that America, as powerful as it is, cannot control the world, cannot rule the world. We cannot, we struggle to impose our will even in relatively small, less developed countries in the world, right? Where one would think that a great power would have no problem imposing itself. So we know that in order to tackle these essential issues, that we have to cooperate. And I think that sort of public relations campaign by smaller states will do that. Now, a lot of that too is that of creating coalitions of states. Coalitions of like-minded states that are facing the same challenges that can operate together, and also to sort of play, some of the larger states the larger states are in an influence for power. And this is something we may be able to get to later, this debate about whether we're entering a new Cold War or not. And I think we don't, I don't think that we're there yet. I don't necessarily think we have to frame it in those terms, but certainly the great power states still vie for influence from smaller states throughout the world. And so smaller states can sort of wield that sort of alliance or diplomacy to ally with a state based upon how that state is treating the state, whether or not it is sympathetic to the challenges that that state faces, or whether the power state is simply acting upon these realist Athenian impulses that we examined earlier in our discussion.
Okay. Mr. Dimopoulos, another question has come through. Now, obviously, you are not just an expert on international relations, but I can tell that you're also an expert in Greek history. But I'm going to ask you a question that goes a little bit beyond Greece. One of our viewers is wondering if there have been lessons in diplomacy from other large empires, such as the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Ottoman Empire, that differs from what you know about ancient Greece, and maybe how those other empires have impacted modern diplomacy.
Yes, this is a question that combines many elements. Yes, each empire has its own traits and attributes. So first of all, since we started about empires, the issue about effective diplomacy in empires, I would say that the empire that was renowned of having very good diplomats and very good traits of diplomacy was the Byzantine Empire, which was the Eastern Roman Empire that evolved from the Western part of the Roman Empire that was collapsing. So we have it's the epitome of diplomacy and the basis of diplomacy. We see it, we witness them during the Byzantine times, that we see, if someone reads Byzantine history, will also see about the ritual. When someone would come, for example, to the Byzantine Empire, he would arrive to Constantinople, which was the capital, to discuss about an issue, even if he was a foe, even if he was an enemy. Okay, he would just sit down for 1 or 2 days, just feast, drink, enjoy himself, and then the discussion on the topic would start. Diplomacy evolves as in the period of time. Modern day diplomats differ from diplomats in the age of empires, which were, for example, diplomats of the 21st century, diplomats of the 20th century differ a lot from diplomats of the 19th century. We're not nobles doing this. We're not aristocrats or something like this. That we are sort like agents. So we have, if you allow me, stricter mandates on our job. A diplomat in the past was, especially when we discuss about empires, he would be someone very close to the emperor or the imperial court. So I think that history teaches us different lessons, not only for diplomats, but for empires in general. For example, if we start from the Hellenistic Empire, for example, after the expedition of Alexander the Great and the Hellenistic kingdoms, and then we go on to the Roman Empire, to the Byzantine Empire, to the Ottoman Empire, even to the British Empire, we can witness, apart from the evolution of diplomacy, obviously, because when in the past we did not have an international law-based system. For example, during the Roman times, it was Pax Romana that we were implementing, or later on Pax Britannica that we were implementing, which more or less, to my ears, sounds like the law of the strong. So I think that in all these cases, we witness a downward spiral that each empire engages because they abuse their power and cannot see the signs of demise, I think.
Consul General, Sophia Rivera, another one of our viewers, is asking a question that has kind of been on the forefront of my mind in preparation for today's presentation that you've done. And I think it might even be a good final question, because it's going to be a very detailed answer that you and Dr. Collins give. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Dimopoulos, because, you know, as a member of the foreign ministry, I know that you are in the know, as we say in the United States, on this issue. Sophia writes, the escalating political crisis in Belarus clearly presents a threat to national security of many states in the European Union. Belarus is currently sending thousands of refugees from Syria and Iraq to destabilize the situation in the EU. Right now, the EU countries took a defensive approach by spending hundreds of millions of dollars to build the walls on the borders. Do you predict or see any offensive approach directed at Belarus rather, from the EU? And this is perfect for you, because it wasn't so long ago that Greece was contending with its own hundreds of thousands of migrants from Africa and the Middle East as well. So what is your take on this situation?
That is an excellent question, first of all. Secondly, I want to start from the point that you concluded, speaking about migrants, not refugees necessarily, to be precise, because when Greece was dealing with this issue, Greece has not been dealing with this issue now. Greece has been dealing with this issue for more than 5-6 years, at least, to say the least. And we've been accused by listening to the narrative that we are refusing entry to refugees. We have witnessed, when we showed a decisive stance last year at our border, that we had migrants coming from Algeria, Morocco, and they demanded that they should be accepted into the country. So I think that the issue of these migrant flows is also an asymmetric, or allow me to say, a hybrid threat as well. It is a new threat that has evolved. Now, I don't think that I will be able to answer precisely whether Belarus is manipulating those migrant flows to pose specific problems, or as a cover-up to what is going in the country, because it is already, I think that it is not to Belarus interest or advantage to escalate any situation, as long as it is already in a phase of let's say in a trajectory of that the EU is against Belarus and is willing to go on with and proceed with sanctions and all this. So I think that maybe because we witness migrant traffickers. Okay, there are trafficking networks that are operating. I think that they're searching for a different route. I cannot answer precisely if this is an issue of destabilization from Belarus to the Eastern European subsystem, if we speak like that. But I think that given the circumstances, I think that yes, EU would be. I think that EU would be willing and most probably will implement sanctions. That there will be sanctions against Belarus on this if this continues at the same pace.
Right. Dr. Collins, we have just a couple minutes left. I'm going to let you have the last word, because I'm very curious about your answer to Sophia's question. But before you give the answer, Dr. Collins, for all of you who are watching, we're about to launch a poll asking you about your thoughts regarding today's discussion. So please fill that out as Dr. Collins answers the questions about the crisis at the Belarus border. Go ahead, Dr. Collins.
Well, thank you. I think that Belarus is making the same mistake that Imperial Japan made on the eve of World War II, or on the eve of U.S. interest into World War II, in that Japan gambled that as a reaction to the sanctions, the economic sanctions that was placed on Japan by the United States, to relieve itself of those sanctions, that Japan would launch an attack on Pearl Harbor that would damage the United States and would send a signal to the United States that these sanctions are costing Japan. Japan will not stand for this. And the United States is a paper tiger. The United States will not respond to this aggression. And what it will do is it will chasten the United States. The United States will drop these sanctions on Japan, which were onerous. Belarus is facing similar significant and painful sanctions from the European Union because of the repression of the Lukashenko regime. Lukashenko has responded with, and Consul Dimopoulos very rightly called it, hybrid war, in which it's placing pressure on Poland, a member of the European Union, and Poland is where it can apply pressure because it borders on Poland, to send a massive, very substantial flow of refugees, migrants, and in fact, operating, it seems, with some compliance of the Turkish government, and the number of flights from Turkey to Belarus have increased from about 3 a day to 60 a day. And these migrants that are being pushed across the border into Poland, creating a tremendous security and refugee crisis in Poland. And instead of cowing the European Union and forcing the European Union to drop its sanctions, this has actually galvanized the European Union, much like the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor galvanized the United States, and the United States responded very assertively to this attack, and it led to the demise of the Japanese government. And so the European Union has already announced that it will increase, this morning announced that it will increase sanctions on Belarus. I don't think military action will be taken at this stage by the European Union, but this will only marginalize Belarus even more in the global economy.
Okay, thank you for that wonderful answer to this crisis that's going on, that in many ways exemplifies everything that we've spoken about this morning. That is all the time we have for today's Consular Connections discussion. I think everyone would agree we could easily have gone another 20-30 minutes because it was so interesting. Consul General Theodoros Dimopoulos, thank you so much for joining us today. I learned a lot from the Melos dialogue and how we can apply it to today's events. Dr. Stephen Collins, you were fantastic. Thank you again for giving us your perspective on all this. I'm now going to turn the program over to Lola. So thank you all for joining us, and Lola will tell you what's coming up next.
Yes, I would also like to give a huge thank you to Dr. Azriel for moderating our panel, also our panel that we had last month with the Consul General of Japan. We plan on doing this again in the spring semester, so we will include you all in our email list and send you information. But of course, thank you so much to Consul Dimopoulos and Dr. Collins for a very engaging panel, and of course, Consul Dimopoulos for a great presentation as well. I would also like to thank Tara McDuffie, our Executive Director, Division of Global Affairs, for welcoming us all. I know we're over time, so if you haven't completed the poll, please do that. Also for students, and I guess for any individuals that are engaged with students, staff, or faculty, we do have a virtual youth conversation seminar that's going to start at 1. So please rejoin around 1 p.m. You have the opportunity to engage more with Consul Dimopoulos, ask him any questions about his role, about the consulate, and international relations, and further to continue after our presentation today. So thank you so much. We appreciate all of you for your participation, and please, for the students, please join us later on in the afternoon.
See you later.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.